Was Aleister Crowley a hypnotist? Actually, he was, and we'll be exploring so in our 3-part series, Hypnotic Circles around Aleister Crowley.
If you were in Paris on April 18th, 1929, and picked up a copy of L'Intransigeant, your eyes would fall to the right-hand corner of the front page, and there you would have spotted this article about Sir Aleister Crowley written by Charlotte Chabrier, in which she said of Crowley, "In gratitude for the fact that I had introduced him to the director of a major magazine, whose English correspondent greatly admired his sonnets, he graciously wanted to initiate me into occultism, and I remember a session at my home, when I was living in this Montparnasse district, which seems hideous to me today, in which he pretended to prevent those present, by the mere force of his fluid, from counting out loud further than 20. Alas, I went without the slightest difficulty to 30, and only stopped because I'd had enough. But the other ladies, more influential, more amiable, gave him the satisfaction which, as a good mistress of the house, I should have given first to him. He also said that he could see through the thickest walls with a look of full rays which pierced all obstacles. I'm quite sure of the opposite. For how many times I saw him cross the courtyard, which preceded my flat, and come and ring tirelessly at my door, behind which I stood without moving, not being disposed to talk about occultism when my housework was not done. He had convinced those around him that he could dislodge himself from his body at will. Perhaps this would be the moment for him to use this rare faculty."
The subject of hypnotism circles Crowley, the same way that Crowley's circle was greatly influenced by hypnosis. When Crowley was trying to promulgate Thelema, his chosen vehicle was the Ordo Templi Orientis. The OTO was founded by Karl Kellner and Theodore Reuss, and after Kellner had passed away, Reuss went on to become head of the OTO. In 1925, Crowley ended up taking this position, but long prior to that, Reuss had bestowed on him many high-ranking Masonic degrees. Reuss obtained authorization to perform the Rite of Memphis and Mizraim from John Yarker, and obtained permission to perform Martinist rites from Gerard Encause.
Encausse had written Magick and Hypnosis. This was a collection of experiences justifying and proving the teachings of occultism. We had translated this work into English a number of years ago. However, there are some lingering formatting issues, and we wish to expand upon the footnotes. However, we are going to make this work available very soon.
Encausse was not only a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in Paris, but he also founded the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Croix and went on to found the modern Martinist Order, the latter of which Theodore Reuss would become special inspector of in Germany. Encausse had founded the journal Les Initiations, which focused heavily on hypnotism, Kabbalah, Freemasonry, and the occult sciences. Encausse was a renowned hypnotist at the time, being head of the Laboratoire de Hypnologie at the Hôpital de la Charité, and editor-in-chief of the Revue de Hypnologie. So, we've looked at Encausse briefly. Let's turn back to John Yarker. In his book, Arcane Schools, Yarker writes, "What in these times is called hypnotism, mesmerism, trance was well known to the ancients." Tobias Churton, in his book Aleister Crowley in America, recalls an incident in which Aleister Crowley picks up a book from his bookshelf and has a moment of realization because he's fascinated by the link between ritual and the phenomenon of the book coming to hand. That book being a gift from the late John Yarker.
The book that Yarker had actually gifted was Magnetism, written by Jules Dennis, or known under his nom de plume, Baron du Potet. Now, we would be remiss not to point out that du Potet was part of a number of hypnotic experiments recorded across scientific literature. As an influence on Magick, Eliphas Lévi appreciated du Potet too, referencing him in a few of his works and writing praisingly of him in the history of Magick. We're personally a bit uncertain if the book from Yarker was an introduction to the study of animal magnetism, or if it was perhaps La Magie dévoilée, which could be translated as Magick Unveiled, but in the English world it was published as Magick and Magnetism. Denis' Magick and Magnetism mentions that all magical workings are done through magnetism, and that in magnetism is the presence of magic. Ironic of Yarker to gift that book to Crowley, of course, if it is the book that is being referred to, in which case it also goes on to say, many magnetizers used magic unconsciously. Freemasonry contains this knowledge, but is powerless, retaining nothing but the words, and so is ineffective. Now, we've touched on occultist, hypnotist Gerard Encause, but he was also known as Papus. Do you know where he got that name from? Well, he actually borrowed it from the Noctemerion of Apollonius of Tyana. And specifically, the name Papus was on a list of genii and was translated as physician. The Greek work had been translated and made available to French speakers by Eliphas Lévi. Aleister Crowley saw himself continuing Lévi's work, even considering himself a reincarnation of Lévi. And that wasn't even in jest. Lévi's work laid out that true love, natural love, was the miracle of magnetism, and that in order for one to magnetize, they must be wise and righteous and carry in themselves the light of life. Lévi also spoke of the church and how the church utilizes magnetism as one of its chief powers, which is why it must condemn magic. When Crowley had been writing his thesis for the grade of Adeptus Exemptus, the highest attainable grade by living beings in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, he simply translated Lévi's Le Clef des Grands Mystères into English as the key of the mysteries, and so had abandoned writing his original work. As Lévi had said all he could or would. The work makes repeated references to magnetism or hypnotism. We've been attracted to various points of interest, but let us return to how we opened, with Aleister Crowley performing hypnosis, like a stage hypnotist in front of a group of ladies in Charlotte Chabrier's home. If that sounds fictional, well, a lot of fiction writers have modelled their characters or villains after Aleister Crowley. Take The Magician, written by Somerset Maugham, whose main character, Oliver Haddo, was heavily inspired by the Great Beast. And in addition to that, this character was described as having great hypnotic power. Dion Fortune too would characterise the Beast. A fun aspect of Fortune's novels was that she often laid fiction over reality. Her novel, The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, is said to be based on Fortune's spiritual teacher, Dr. Moriarty. Her introduction to the book even states that the key location of the book, Taverner's mysterious nursing home, was actually fact, and that life is infinitely stranger than fiction could ever possibly be. Dr. Taverner is a psychiatrist of sorts who has excellent control of hypnotic powers and uses his talent for the benefit and healing of others. The hypnotic power discussed in her 1935 novel, The Winged Bull, is possessed by a black magician by the name of Astley. In the novel, Astley has psychic control over a woman named Ursula and plans on using her in a Black Lodge ritual, possibly a sacrifice. One scene in the book has the characters talking with a doctor about the hypnotic control Astley has over Ursula, and all are flabbergasted by the domineering ability of this villain. Astley knows more about the rarer aspects of hypnosis than any man in Europe. I know a good deal about it, but I can't hold a candle to Astley. In August of 1914, an article appeared in the New York World magazine detailing how Aleister Crowley had attended a black mass. In fact, Tobias Churton, in his book Aleister Crowley in America, later details that in December that year, Aleister Crowley denied ever attending such a mass, asserting that he had hypnotized the newspaperman who wrote it. Aleister Crowley, the hypnotist, was not just found in fiction or referred to by himself and others as a hypnotist in newspapers. Another who had been caught up in Crowley's gaze and described it as hypnotic was occult writer Bernard Bromage, a friend of Dion Fortune's. Bernard Bromage is the writer of such books as Tibetan Yoga and In Tune with Your Destiny, The Occult Way to Inner Peace, and The Occult Arts of Ancient Egypt. Bromage had met Aleister Crowley in 1935 and published an article about their meeting for Light magazine. He met with the Beast at his Great Ormond Street residence on a night where Crowley's asthma was bothering him quite a bit. Bromage described his voice as being high-pitched and wheezy. When offered by Crowley, Bromage declined the invitation of his host to eat toffee or drink coffee, having heard of Crowley's want to test drugs on the unsuspecting. It was a rather uneventful evening accounted, though Bromage at one point was being walked around by Crowley, who had been doing a breathing exercise down the back of his neck. The way in which this was done had indicated to Bromage that Crowley had knowledge of the tantric hypnotic system, which he was able to counter with some astral dexterity, given that Bromage was more familiar than most with the subject. More familiar than was Crowley. After Crowley retreated, they would engage in conversation about mundane matters. The Beast was living with a woman who Bromage simply referred to as the Pale Lady, who unfortunately divulged a bit too much information about herself and said that she was also living there to look after Crowley because she was his mother and he needed to be looked after because he was a child. Of the positives said of Crowley, Bromage stated that as an art critic, Crowley impressed him more than as a magician. Though he had to admit that Crowley's hypnotic power was astonishing and that he was able to mollify and talk over a rather reputable solicitor who would pop by the house to read them the riot act. Crowley was in the basement, naked, trying to perform the rite of Pan. Funnily enough, this was also the same house that Crowley had been kicked out of, and it also happened to be the same house that he and Bromage had first met. This detailed account was the last formal meeting between the two, although they would have other run-ins in the future. Bromage stated that Crowley keenly observed him and tested mental control tricks that would have pulled a fast one on one lesser experienced in these matters. He wrote that Crowley was a hypnotist, both natural and trained, of no mean order. I could credit some of his tales I had heard of his immense fascination for women, how, granted the time and the date and the loved one all together, they would surrender all they had, money, titles, social position, to take up their burden and follow him. What were they seeing in Crowley? Why was he so magnetic? Let's look at a testimony from Viola Bankes, who acted as an intermediary between Aleister Crowley and an actor by the name of Paul Robeson, an actor who Crowley had spent time trying to rope into performing his play, Mortadello, a play that the Times had described as a flop, a masterpiece.
Unfortunately, Paul Robeson didn't end up performing in the play, though Viola Bankes did find the urge to write about her first impressions upon meeting Crowley. She would go on to describe Crowley as having neither the powerful, compelling features of a magician or the strong or nervous hands of a poet. Polite society, man. Just say he was ugly, that's it. She described Crowley's hands as being unusually small, bringing to her mind delicate bird's claws. His voice, while she expected it to be more sonorous, was rather light and high for a man. His eyes, however, captured her, and in them lay the answer to the riddle. Bankes describes that through his gaze, Crowley's willpower and deep occult knowledge could dominate a weaker and untrained will to the extent that it is called magnetism. And she believed that if he so desired, he could obtain absolute mastery over the mind and body of his subjects. She said if one stared into his eyes, they could scarcely fail to feel the thrill of magnetism that emanated from their green depths. Tell that to Charlotte Chabrier. There's much more for us to dig into, and we've got 2 more servings to offer. So before we go, let's dive into Aleister Crowley's diary. This is an unpublished diary entry from March 15th, 1902, which shows that astrologer and geomancer Elahi Bush once arrived at Crowley's door, and how he taught Crowley to obtain a deadly hypnotic power. Look hard at this point on the wall, unwinking for many days, gradually increasing time. You will thus obtain hypnotic power, even to deadly and hostile current of will. Is that meditation stuff?
You weary me with proof enough that all this meditation stuff is self-hypnosis. Be it so. Do you suppose I did not know? Still, to be accurate, I fear the symptoms are entirely strange. If I were hard, I'd make it clear that criticism must arrange an explanation different for this particular event. Surely, your best work always finds itself sole object of the mind's. In vain you ply the brush, distracted by something you have heard or acted. Expect some tedious visitor. Your eye runs furtive to the door. Your hand refuses to obey. You throw the useless brush away. I think I hear the word you say. Aleister Crowley.
What we found in your room justified all our fears. How long have you been reading these horrid books?
That old black magic has made. That's right. That old black magic
The door opened, as though being pulled by some unknown force.
Encausse had founded the journal Initiation. Encausse had founded the journal L'Initiation. Queen. Oh, I get. Oh, the phenomenon and the link between ritual and Dion Fortune. oh, Mr. Crowley. 20. Is that good? Control tricks and tested mental control tricks. Okay. Ready?
Yeah, it's recording.
Okay.